Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Crazy Orc Scientist and the Orc Time Jumper from Puppets of War. So for the Time Jumper I've used some matte black spray, and for the Scientist I've used some matte white spray. Both of these sprays were from Colourforge. Mine is going to be based on Back to the Future 2 and I want to make sure I get the colours right, so I'm going to use these guys as a reference. And with that in mind, the very first paint I'm going to use is Mephiston Red to paint the overalls of the Mad Scientist. I'm then going to use some Corn Red to paint the shirt of the robot. Let's just call him Morky. Then both of these will be washed with some Carroburg Crimson. And while that wash dries and through blurred fingers, I'm going to use some Lead Belcher to paint any metallics, or most of the metallics, on both characters. I'm then going to use Iron Warriors to paint the rest of the stuff. However, at one point I did change my mind and I used some Lead Belcher to paint the Flux Capacitor. I also used some Abaddon Black to paint the inside of the Flux Capacitor. Then all the metals were given a wash with some Nuln Oil. And while that wash dries, we'll move back to the red. For the Mephiston Red, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sunz Scarlet for the first highlight. This will be followed by Evil Sunz Scarlet just by itself. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Evil Sunz Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. I'm then going to add a few dots of matte white on the overalls to represent some kind of pattern. And this will be followed by the same process but with some Macragge Blue. I'm then going to highlight the Corn Red with a 50-50 mix of Corn Red and Wazdacker Red. And this will be followed by Wazdacker Red just by itself. To paint the rest of Morky's shirt, I'm going to use some Wild Rider Red. And I'll give it a wash with some Fuegryn Orange. While that wash dries, I'm going to use some Emperor's Children to start painting the hoverboard. And I'll give that a wash with some Carroburg Crimson. To paint the flesh on the Scientist, I'm going to use, I haven't come up with a witty name, I'm going to use some Auric Flesh. And then I'll wash that with some Athonian Camo Shade. While that wash on the skin dries, I'm going to go back to Morky's shirt and I'm just going to re-highlight the Wild Rider Red, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. I'll then use a 50-50 mix of Wild Rider Red and Matte White for the first highlight. And then for the final highlight, I'll use that same mix, but at a 70-30 split in favour of Matte White for an edge highlight. For the hoverboard, I'm going to relayer the Emperor's Children. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Emperor's Children and Fulgrim Pink for the highlight. Next, I'm going to use some Genestealer Purple to start marking in the patterns of the hoverboard. And these will be given a highlight of a 50-50 mix of Genestealer Purple and Matte White. Then for the yellow stripes, I'm going to use some Flash Gets Yellow. And they'll be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Flash Gets Yellow and Matte White. Next, I'm going to use some Warpstone Glow to draw in the green lines. And then finally, I'm going to use some Matte White for the final white sections. Next, I'm going to use some Auric Flesh to relayer the skin, making sure I avoid any of the recesses, of course. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Auric Flesh and Nurgling Green. And then Nurgling Green just by itself. Lastly, I'll use a very small mix of a 50-50 mix of Nurgling Green and Matte White for the final highlight, and this is just on the tips or anywhere you feel like the light would catch the most. Next, for the large coat and his gloves and his trousers, I'm going to use some Avalan Sunset. And all of that yellow will then get washed with some Cassandori yellow. While that dries, I'm going to get his teeth out of the way. First of all, I'm going to use some Morghast bone. And I'm going to paint the inside of his mouth with some Screamer pink. I'll then wash that whole area with some Agrax Earthshade. To paint the batteries in his backpack, I'm going to use some Trollslayer Orange. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Trollslayer Orange and Fire Dragon Bright. And then lastly, Fire Dragon Bright just by itself. Next, I'll paint his boots black, which I'll highlight with some Corvus Black. These will then be given a second highlight, but this time with some Eshin Grey. Once the wash on the teeth is dried, I'm going to relayer the Morghast bone. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast bone and Wraithbone. And then finally, Wraithbone just by itself. So the lower part of his armor on the boots, I'm going to use some Mephiston Red. And then I'll use some Evil Sunz Scarlet to give those a highlight. This highlight will be followed up by a second highlight, but this time using Wild Rider Red. Then I'll paint the knee guards with some Warpstone Glow. And these will get a little wash with some Beltane Green. For any straps and bandages, I'm going to use some Xandri Dust. I'll give these a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. Then going back to the knee pads, I'm going to relayer the Warpstone Glow. And use a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and Moot Green for the highlight. I'm then going to paint the straps of the backpack with some Mornfang Brown. I'll then give these a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. And then to highlight those bandages once the wash is dried, I'm going to use some Ushabti Bone. Then I'm going to work on the flux capacitor for a little bit, and I'm going to use a little bit of Evil Sunz Scarlet just to paint in the back sections. This will be followed by Avalanche Sunset for the centerpiece. Then a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Dawn Yellow. And then finally Dawn Yellow just by itself. This is focused mostly in the center. Going back to the straps on the backpack, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Mornfang Brown and Scrag Brown for the first highlight. And this will be followed by Scrag Brown just by itself. I'm then going to use some Moot Green to paint the base of the portal gun. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Moot Green and Matte White. And then I'm going to use Matte White just to paint the top and do a couple of streaks down the side to represent reflections of light. Any pipes and tubing I'm going to paint with some Skavenblight Dinge. And I'll give those a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. While that dries, I'm going to use some Grey Seer to paint his hair. And then I'll use a very, very gentle and light dry brush of a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White. Followed by another dry brush, but this time Matte White just by itself. Next we'll go back to the metals, and any bronze are going to be painted with some Screaming Bell, while any remaining bits of silver will be painted with Lead Belcher. The Screaming Bell will then be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. And to start highlighting that silver, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Lead Belcher and Stormhost Silver. And once the wash is dried on the Screaming Bell, I'm going to use some Hash Hut Copper to highlight. It's now finally time to start working on the yellow, and for that I'm going to relayer all the yellow using some Avalanche Sunset, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. This will then be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Flash Gitz Yellow. And then the final highlight of Flash gets yellow just by itself. To highlight the pipes and the tubing, I'm going to use some Storm Vermin Fur. To paint little Morky's eyes, I'm going to use some Evil Sunz Scarlet. This will be followed up by some Wild Rider Red. Then a 50-50 mix of Wild Rider Red and Matte White. And then finally, Matte White just by itself in the centre for a tiny little reflective dot. And with that, that's the Orc out of the way. So now we're going to move on to the DeLorean, or Orcian. That doesn't really work, does it? Anyway, so I'm going to be using, for the first colour, and this is the vast majority of the paint, some lead belcher to give it a nice silver look. Then to paint the windshield, or the blocked off windshield, I'm going to use some Iron Warriors, so we've got a little bit of a deeper or darker silver. And then we're going to wash the entire thing with some Nuln Oil. Once that wash is dried, we're then going to use some lead belcher to dry brush the entire model. This is basically just to help pick out the details, but also maintain that wash. This will then be followed by a second dry brush, but this time we are using Iron Hand Steel. And then lastly, as a final dry brush, we're going to be using some Stormhost Silver. From there, any black details that will be worked on are going to be painted with Abaddon Black just to tidy things up and get rid of any dry brush marks. Then all that black will be highlighted with some Corvus Black. And then finally, Eshin Grey. Then for the engine and a few other bits and bobs here and there, I'm going to use some Screaming Bell. And for a couple of parts of the engine as well, I'm also going to use some Retributor armor, just so there's a little bit of variation in the golden colours. For some of the wires that I didn't paint black, I'm going to paint those with some Skaven Blight Dinge. And any bandages or bits of tape or things like that, I'm going to use some Xandri Dust. Then all those areas starting from the Screaming Bell will be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. I'm also going to use it to wash the exhaust, so I want those to look a little bit grubbier and dirtier than the rest of the vehicle. Once that wash is dried, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Screaming Bell and Hash Hut Copper for the first highlight on all the areas that are going to be copper. And this will be followed by Hash Hut Copper just by itself for the final highlight. Any of the wires, pipes and tubes that I painted with Skaven Blight Dinge will get a highlight with some Storm Vermin Fur. Then the gold sections will get relayered with some Retributor armor, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Retributor armor and Uruk armor gold for the highlight. For any bandages, I'm going to relayer the Xandri Dust. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Xandri Dust and Ushabti Bone. And lastly, an edge highlight of Ushabti Bone just by itself. I'm going to paint a few of the wires with Mephiston Red, as I want a few bits of colour to pop out. I'm also going to paint some of the sort of metal pieces that have been attached to it, but not very many though, as I want the bulk of the colour to remain as close to the actual Back to the Future DeLorean as possible. And also, as a slight variation in the red, I'm also going to use some Corn Red. This is mostly going to be used on the metal patchwork. Then any of those red areas will be washed with some Carroburg Crimson. My camera is then going to completely defocus as I used Avalanche Sunset to paint a few of the wires. And I'll give those a quick wash with some Cassandora Yellow. Once those washes have dried, I'm then going to use Evil Sunz Scarlet to highlight any Mephiston Red. And I'll follow that up with some Wild Rider Red. For the Corn Red, I'm going to highlight that with some Wazdaka Red. And the yellow will be then highlighted using some Flash Kits yellow. Next, I'm going to paint the Mr. Fusion part of the DeLorean, and for that, I'm just going to start with some grey cere. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of grey cere and matte white. And then finally, matte white just by itself for the highlight. On the bomb rack, I'm going to use a little bit of Macragge blue. And naturally, I'll use Calgar blue to give it a highlight. For the lights on the DeLorean, I'm going to use some matte white to begin with as a base. And for the bulk of the colour, I'm going to wash that with some Cassandora yellow. Next, I'm going to break out the Iron Warriors. I'm going to paint any areas that I want to be a slightly darker metal. And this will be followed by some Lead Belcher as well to paint the rest of the bits that I feel like should be metallic rather than a painted colour. These sections and some of the patchwork sections will then be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. Once that wash is dried, I'm going to very carefully and very lightly dry brush a tiny bit of Stormhost Silver onto those painted areas so it looks like a little sort of chips of paint have been chipped away. All that's left to do now is to base your models, and you can base them however you like. I just went for some simple Astro Granite as that matches the rest of my Orc army. I actually loved painting these guys. These are two of the best models and most sort of wonderful models I've ever painted, and they didn't take too long. Well, they did take quite a long time actually, to be honest. You're going to see a video, hopefully see a video I should say soon, for the Mad Scientist. He took alone 4 hours, or roughly 4 hours to paint, and the vehicle itself that also took around about 4 hours. So you're looking around about 8 hours for the pair. And if you followed this guide, I really do hope it helped, and I really hope you had as much fun painting these things as I did. I'm going to get some more Puppets of War stuff, I think, because they're really good models. And, well, quite frankly, it makes a change from the usual Warhammer 40,000 stuff. And if you want to see sort of that, which whenever I get them, give the channel a subscribe. And, well, all that's left to say is thank you so much for watching. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.